In addition, I'd like to recognize all members of the President's Council of the Richard Nixon Foundation. Thank you for your continued support of this foundation and this library. We could not do this without you. Tonight will be a far-ranging conversation on the ever-important topic of education. This is appropriate as just a few weeks ago, from this very stage, the Nixon Foundation announced the launch of new initiatives in education. We want to teach students about civics, the Constitution, and the history of American foreign policy. Tonight, Secretary DeVos will be interviewed by Jim Byron, the President and CEO of the Richard Nixon Foundation. Jim has led the Nixon Foundation through a very exciting time. We are right now in the middle of celebrating all of the important and monumental 50th anniversaries of the Nixon administration. These include the National Cancer Act, the signing of Title IX, and the groundbreaking diplomatic missions to China and Russia. Betsy DeVos. Betsy DeVos is a leader, an innovator, a disruptor, and a champion for freedom. She is the nation's leading advocate for education freedom today. She served as the 11th U.S. Secretary of Education from 2017 to 2021. For more than 3 decades, Secretary DeVos has been tireless in her pursuit of reforms that allow students the freedom, the flexibility, the resources, and the support they need to choose when, where, and how they learn. This inspirational story is covered in her book, Hostages No More: The Fight for Education Freedom and the Future of the American Child. Please join me in welcoming Secretary DeVos and Jim Byron.
Well, thank you, Joe, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And welcome, Betsy, to the Nixon Library.
Thank you so much, Jim.
And her husband, Dick. Welcome, sir, and thank you for being here as well. It's a pleasure to have you, and I want to give you as much time tonight, so let's dive right into it. Your new book, Hostages No More, is terrific. Many Americans agree that education, and particularly K through 12 education in America, is subpar. You go 10 steps further, and you say that the system is antiquated and needs to be completely overhauled because, quote, different students learn in different ways. So as you do in this remarkable last chapter of I really encourage everybody to read the book. In the remarkable last chapter of the book, let's picture this. The year is 2030, and students are learning in all kinds of different ways at custom-tailored programs all throughout the country for what works best for them. That is the vision. Contrast your vision for education freedom with the reality of today.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jim, and thank you to the library for having me here today and for welcoming my husband, Dick, and me. We're thrilled to be here, and I'm especially thrilled that Dick is here because he safely got us here as a pilot today. So what you've asked about the vision that I paint in the book about what could be in the year 2030 versus what most kids experience today. I would roll that back actually a couple of years before today because the last 2 years have been anything but normal or usual for most kids across the country as we've navigated a COVID pandemic. And I'm sure we'll get more into the implications of that. But for 175 years, the way kids in K-12 years experience their learning has remained substantially unchanged from when it was founded. And Horace Mann, who's known as the father of our K-12 system, said at the time that educators can look upon educators are enabled to look upon parents as having given hostages to their cause and to our cause, speaking of the cause of of the K-12 education system at the time. And we have seen that system impose upon kids for decades an approach that for too many of them simply doesn't work. And we've seen it in the numbers well before the COVID pandemic. Our nation is not in the top 10 by any measure as compared to other countries in the world. And internally, when you look at the results for kids, it's the kids who are the most vulnerable and the ones actually, in most cases, for whom the most money is invested, we're getting the worst results. And for them, they are not learning, and that has real serious implications for the long term for our country. So my contention has been for more than 35 years now, and I've been involved in trying to change policy to support families making these choices and decisions for their kids and finding that right fit, because we have seen for too long the one-size-fits-all industrial model approach is simply not working, and yet we've spent more and more money year after year expecting a different outcome, and in fact seeing poorer and poorer results for kids.
So tonight we're joined by 8 candidates for school board from Orange County and from San Bernardino County, and we have 2 members of the Orange County Department of Education, including the president, Lisa Sparks. And I know that they are all proponents of the Betsy DeVos vision. Mm-hmm. So how do we get there to what you envision and have just described?
Well, it starts with ultimately empowering families with the resources that are already being spent on the child. And I use the metaphor of a backpack. Kids go to school every day with the things they need for the day in their backpack. We need to metaphorically attach those dollars that are already being used for that child's education through the system and attach that to that child's backpack so that the family can make the decision and choice. And we have seen in countless cases where you have more choices, and I generally refer to the state of Florida, which is the furthest along, thanks to former Governor Jeb Bush's groundbreaking efforts to establish a variety of choice mechanisms in Florida when he was governor, and then successive legislatures and governors building on that big move. We have seen where, in the case where more than half the kids in almost across the state of Florida, where the greatest percentage of children are going to schools other than their assigned schools, we've seen the outcomes improve for everyone, including those who stay in their assigned school. And so I applaud all of you here who are running for school board or are serving on school boards now, and just encourage you to make sure that you are championing that opportunity for families, because ultimately all schools, traditional public schools among them, will be strengthened as a result. And what the system refuses to do today in a monopolistic environment will become much more agile and much more responsive in one where the families ultimately have the control of those resources or the ability to direct those resources. And I would just mention, we spend $750 billion a year in America on K-12 education. And yet, as I mentioned, we are not even in the top 10 of any country around the world in terms of the achievement levels our kids are making. And so you can't keep advocating spending more and more money and doing the same thing and expect a different result.
Yeah. You write on page 175, we need to expand our thinking about what education actually is and what it is for. And I think that says it very well. So you are the country's leading champion pushing to make all of this happen. Educational freedom, educational reform, but let's talk about you. You grew up in Holland, Michigan. Your mother was a teacher. Your father was self-made and built a successful manufacturing company, and you write about all of this in the book. What was the spark or the call to action for you that said, we have to be better at this and I can have a real impact here?
Well, let me first of all say there have been many, many others with whom I've worked shoulder to shoulder for many years to really change policy. But my interest in this really went back to when Dixon, my son, oldest son, we have 4 children, all grown, 10 grandchildren, 13 step-grandchildren, so we have a lot of different kinds of learners in our family. But when our son Rick was about to start kindergarten, he had been going to a Montessori preschool and just loved it. Loved that independent work and ability to sort of do his thing and learn in the way that worked for him. So I was very curious about what we might find in terms of schools in our area that would be would continue to unlock that creativity for him. In the process of looking, I came across a little Christian urban school in the heart of our city that was serving kids in that immediate neighborhood. And the founders of the school happened to be graduates of my alma mater, Calvin College. And they, started this after-school program. But then after a couple of years, they were having so many kids come twice a week to their after-school program, they were really compelled to start a small school as a result. So this became what's called the Potter's House, and this wonderful school is still 3 blocks down the street from a school at the time, a traditional school at the time that was amongst the lowest performers in the entire state. And while we didn't choose that school for Rick, I did start to volunteer there, and I mentored students, and as Dick and I were able to, we began supporting the school more and more. They still today have to raise 90% of the operating funds from benefactors in the area. But for every family that had a child there, I knew that there were 10 or 20 other families from that neighborhood and that area that would have loved to have their child have that kind of opportunity. And so, we started, both Dick and I started efforts to, we started a scholarship organization in Michigan, and then we began to realize that no amount of philanthropy was ultimately going to change the trajectory for, thousands of kids. It really had to do with policy. And then the matter of policy we thought could be one of persuasion through logic or emotion. It was simply not fair that other families couldn't make the same kinds of choices that we did. And then very quickly realized that no, it was really going to take political muscle to go up against the forces of the status quo that protected their interest and still do today. And so that kind of progression really brought me deeper and deeper into all of the efforts to change policy, and a lot of that's recounted in more detail in the book.
Well, one of those forces that you went up against were the American Federation of Teachers. Mm-hmm. And we'll come back to that later in the conversation. But you created the American Federation for Children. What is the American Federation for Children?
Well, American Federation for Children is 3 different organizations under the same umbrella. Part of that realization that it was going to require political efforts along with advocacy and then traditional 501c3 nonprofit work to actually help families into programs once laws were passed. And so AFC does the work of going side by side with folks in targeted states where the environment is ripe to pass policies to support families being able to make these choices. And one of our mottos from the start was that we were only going to get involved in races where we could make a difference. They had to be competitive races where there was a chance to win. And we started in primaries, supporting those who are actually going to support the expansion. And it rolled back to some work that I did in Michigan that, again, it's longer story. I won't recount it all here. But we wanted to make sure that those running for office knew that we were going to be there to support them if they were going to support families and kids. And in other cases, if they refused to, we were not hesitant to make a point of making them an example by beating them. And so that was, that's where it kind of all starts. And then it's really working in those targeted states with the legislators, with the governor, and there has to be a receptive governor, a supportive governor in order to really accomplish this. But it really is a holistic effort to promote policy, pass policy, and then help families find the options that they want to find for their kids once those policies are passed, once those laws are passed.
But I just even love the contrast in the name.
And that was a debate, so that was a subject of a lot of discussion when we were creating it. And I really liked the idea of contrasting the American Federation for Teachers, which, by the way, I don't think the AFT is for teachers at all. I think it's for themselves, those who are running it, and they have a lot of self-interest. They frankly don't do a very good job for teachers that they profess to represent. But I loved the contrast, American Federation for Children versus of teachers, yeah.
So let's jump into policy. In June, just a few months ago, we marked the 50th anniversary of the signing of Title IX. And we did so here at the Nixon Library by gathering 3 Olympic gold medalists to unveil a new exhibition, which all of you actually had a chance to see as you walked in, and you'll have a chance to see it again as you leave. This exhibition goes through how that landmark law came about, as it was signed by President Nixon. The law was only 37 words, but those 37 words opened opportunities for women and girls in sports and really increased their self-confidence. A letter, as opposed to a regulation and certainly not any sort of a new law by the Obama administration, expanded the definition of sex as written in Title IX and sought to apply it to things other than sports, namely having to do with gender. As Secretary of Education, you took this head on. So tell us what you did and how you did it and why.
Well, just to back up a little bit and make sure everybody is aware of what we're talking about with the letter from the Obama administration. So the Obama administration, Office for Civil Rights within the Department of Education, issued a letter to all institutions of higher education, all educational institutions, on how they were to handle matters of sexual misconduct, and also how they were to handle issues of transgender students and what facilities they could access. And it was a blanket letter. This is how you do it. This is how you have to handle it. And what it served to do, specifically as it related to the Title IX law, was to basically do away with due process in these proceedings, and so there were literally hundreds of cases that were being brought to the court system after institutions failed to uphold an individual's rights in a complaint process, and they were being decided for the plaintiff, for the accused all the time, like in 75% of the cases. And it was really a travesty with how it was being handled on campuses all across the country. So we knew coming into office we were going to need to address this issue, but it's a very contentious issue, and understandably so. I mean, these matters are reprehensible. They are tragic, and one wishes we didn't have to address them or deal with them. But we went through the process of rulemaking at the federal level to ensure that every student's rights are protected when it comes to accessing their education. And that really was the goal of Title IX, was to give equal access to both genders to all aspects of education. And this summer, when we observed the 50th anniversary of the signing of President Nixon's signing of that law, I don't think, upon reflection, I don't think anyone, himself included, would have dreamed of what has become of that law today, and how this current administration is trying to use that law to take a far left turn and impose an agenda across the country that is indefensible, in that it totally does away with due process in their proposed rule, and changes what we all know to be the definition of biological sex by gender, and makes it into whatever you decide you are at any given point in time, effectively undermining and doing away with Title IX. Because you can't say that young women can and should have equal access to sports, and then say, on the other hand, that it's okay for a biological male to compete on a woman's team. They're just totally incompatible. And so the Biden administration is attempting to rewrite the very solid, fair, thoughtful, thorough rule that our administration took the time, 2.5 years, to do. They're trying to rewrite that and impose it on everyone in this country. Thankfully, 240,000 people or institutions have submitted comments. They have to respond to all of those. Now, we know ultimately they're going to come out with a rule that is going to be, we think, laden with challengeable, provisions. And so we will, we and lots of allies will continue to fight to retain the very solid rule that we took the time and care to go through and have implemented. But it's just one example of how the best intentions of laws that are passed under the wrong folks, being able to be involved with them, the unintended consequences that we're seeing from that very important law, how they're using it today in a very, very unintended way.
So this is all being pursued and advocated for and by the Department of Education in the Biden administration. Well, when Richard Nixon and later Gerald Ford were president, there wasn't a Department of Education.
That's right.
And you write that the creation of the Department of Education under President Carter was, quote, the first step in making children second-class citizens in their own schools. Why was the Department of Education created?
Well, the department was created in 1979 as a political payoff by Jimmy Carter for the teachers' union's endorsement in 1976, the first time they had made an endorsement of a presidential candidate. And so he fulfilled that pledge in 1979, and what had been the education efforts that had been housed at the federal level were very small, rightfully so. It's the state's role to be putting the laws around their state's educational requirements, and the states actually really fund 92 or 3%, 91 or 92% of K-12 education is funded from the state and local level. The federal government has and does only provide 8 or 9% of the funding overall, and yet it attaches all kinds of strings and rules and regulations, which is why I contend that the department never should have been created in the first place, and why I've been on record for a long time saying, while I was in office, I'd love to work myself out of a job because I don't think the department should exist. And since being in office, I feel even more strongly, because we are seeing how this particular agency is weaponized in a way that has far-reaching implications throughout our entire society. I mean, we look at today how little young people know about our founding documents, about civics, about history, real history. And it goes back to, I believe, the time that this has been an intentional move over the last number of decades to really, take some of these really important pieces of a learning experience out of the center of the stage, and I think it's been to everyone's detriment.
You brought up civics. It's a term that many in my generation may not even be familiar with, because it essentially refers to the duties of being an American citizen. And you write, and I would completely agree with you, that civics has been nearly completely abandoned across our schools. STEM, is very important. It would seem has tended to sort of usurp that in a sense. Have we pivoted too much and lost a sense of national identity in the process?
Oh, I think absolutely so, and I think the last 2 years, as I alluded to earlier on, families had a front row seat to their children's education, and in many cases, families who thought their kids were doing just fine in schools that they had chosen for them by moving to a good district or living in certain locations, and they were very surprised and disappointed in many cases to see the lack of rigor, and the lack of real orientation around finding solutions in a difficult situation. Nobody wanted to have a pandemic that shut down our country for, weeks and months. But in cases where you had solution-oriented folks, kids were back in school as soon as they possibly physically could be. And families who were subjected to months and months and months of lockdowns and then distance learning that was on again, off again, and saw firsthand what their kids were actually learning, they were appalled in many cases by the curriculum that they were being fed, and they were disappointed in other cases by the lack of robust, academically challenging material. And so, and we've seen the results in the nation's report card data also around how little students really understand about our nation's founding, about civics, about the basics, on the way we're organized and why. And so the calls to get back around to this are really important. It's really important also that we not have a national curriculum, because everything that we try to do from the top-down federal level ultimately becomes a political football, and we're seeing this in virtually every way with this current administration.
So in the book, you have gone through an outlined vision for American schools to adapt and change and better support different styles of learning that are uniquely tailored to children and students all over the country. A personalized education. Mm-hmm. And there's been progress. You outline how to do this in your book, but there's something that your predecessor, the former Education Secretary Bill Bennett, called the blob. What is the blob, and why are the decks seemingly stacked against our nation's children?
Well, the blob is affectionately referred to as the blob, but it really is, and I call it the alphabet soup. So it starts with the teachers' unions at the top, who essentially call the shots, and then all of their allied organizations, whether it's the Assistant Principals Association, the Principals Association, the Superintendents Association, the School Boards Association, the PTA. They are all organized. They all have massive offices in Washington. They all have scores of lobbyists that are all doing their bidding. And then when you look at the reports around the giving on the part of these organizations, the teachers' unions give 99+% of their reported contributions to Democrats who then turn around and have promised to do their bidding and to protect and expand the resources that the blob demands. And it's become a cycle that is self-feeding, and it excludes the best interests of students and their families. And this has been going on for many decades, but again, I think it's gotten progressively more intense and worse. And the last 2 years have exposed a lot of this in ways that we wouldn't have seen exposed before. And that's why I'm really very optimistic about states taking the bull by the horns and changing policies that are actually going to support the families in this way. And I do think this is a particularly important window of opportunity to make changes, but the changes also need to be pushed back on at the federal level in terms of the way the blob influences and protects and bolsters the status quo.
Well, and many of the elements of the blob didn't like what you were standing for and pushing for and are very critical of you. But President Nixon said, I'm sure on more than one occasion, if you're controversial, that means you stood for something. So what do you say to your critics that make up the blob and in other areas?
Well, I start by saying I am for students, and I'm for individual students to be able to have the opportunity, an equal opportunity to unlock their talents, their skills, their gifts in ways that are going to work for them. And I go back to the fact that we are still operating under an industrial model of education that is antiquated. When you think about the fact that 175 years ago, roughly the founding of the K-12 system, and Horace Mann, the founder, died 20 years before Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Now think about the fact that he never even contemplated making a telephone call. And today, we've gone from Bell's first telephone to a device that we all carry around in our pockets or our purses, and we can communicate in a multitude of ways on this device. The two systems, looking at these next to one another, you just think, how can we do this with the most important resource we have collectively as a nation, our kids, our future? And how can we say that learning the same way, essentially the same way, in the same approach, 175 years later, is the right answer? You just cannot defend that. And so my contention is, for some kids, that traditional way and approach works just fine, and that's great. They should be able to continue that opportunity. But for so many others, we need to unleash the creativity and the entrepreneurial bent of many in our country to do different things to unlock kids' potential. And I think about I have a lot of examples of schools I've visited that are doing things slightly differently. Now, they're not all perfect, and they're not exhaustive. But there's another little school I haven't yet visited, but it's in West Michigan where we live. Now, those of you who don't know Michigan or haven't been there, Michigan gets very cold in the winter. We have snow. But this little school, the kids there go to school year-round outside all day. And the teachers are outside all day. Now, I'm sure they come in periodically to warm up for, in the coldest. But they're wearing their little wetsuit things that keep them, the wind and the rain out, but they're choosing to be there. Now, it's a private school, and there's a wait list for kids to get into it. But I use this as just a small example of the way that creative people can be thinking about how to help kids learn. I also think about a school that four of our grandchildren go to, which is a very student-directed school where the kids there write their own constitution on how they're going to govern themselves. They set their own goals for their learning goals for the week, and then they hold each other accountable to those goals. And there isn't a traditional teacher there, there's only guides, and the guides can't answer questions, they can only ask other questions when the kids pose questions to them. And our grandkids are flourishing there, they love it. Now, that's not the right answer for all kids, but that's the point. All kids are different, and we have to have different learning environments if we're ultimately going to continue to be competitive as a country. And so that's why we have to really upend the top-down system that's been funded as a system and reorient that funding to be funding students.
That's why I think this book is so good, because it is exactly what is needed in what you've just outlined. And you outline some of that in terms of upending the system and your plans in your confirmation hearing as Secretary of Education. And you have some great anecdotes in your book about your dealings with key members of Congress, both in the confirmation hearings and then later on, both Democrats and Republicans who've been influenced by the teachers' unions, and some of whom even have backed away from educational freedom. Could you tell us a story or two about some of your most memorable?
Some of the most memorable. Well, during the confirmation process, which is talked about at some length in the book, you are asked to, and you're expected to meet with all the members of the committee of the Senate that are going to ultimately vote on your confirmation. And so I did that. I met with everyone who would meet with me. Now there were, I think, one or two that just never seemed to find a time to meet. But, there's some very passionate defenders of the status quo that I met with, and that were very, vocal about their perspectives. And, I think about Elizabeth Warren in particular, who, it was really surprising to me that maybe 15 years before I had to meet her for this confirmation process, she had written a book with her daughter, and in it she called for school choice and education freedom, and then she did a total 180, and arguably, and we know why, because of the power of the teachers' union, and I like to refer to them as a school union, not the teachers' union, because I don't think they're for teachers. And the hypocrisy, because her own child went to a private school, she could afford that, and I was really amazed. It's hard to understand someone with philosophical perspective like she has now embraced, having once been the complete opposite. But then again, there's Charlie Crist down in Florida, who's now running for governor as a Democrat after having served as a Republican and supporting school choice, and taking as his running mate a head of the AFT in Miami. I don't understand. I don't know how you can look in the mirror if that's the approach you're taking. And frankly, Senator Cory Booker was, top among those that did a real about face as well, because he and I had served on the boards of two organizations that were promoting school choice, and then he did a complete 180 as well. And he acknowledged, and I used his quote in the book, that he had aspirations of running for president in 2020, and he said he was taken to the broom closet by the teachers' unions and told he had to back down on his support for that. And again, I don't get that. I don't understand that.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the first charter schools were created by Democrats.
Yes, absolutely right, in the state of Minnesota.
Yeah. So it shouldn't be.
And
a
Polly
controversy.
Williams, a county commissioner or city commissioner in Wisconsin, was the champion for the choice program in Wisconsin, also a Democrat. Yeah, and at the state level, there are a lot of Democrats that do support, support kids and support this issue. And I really, frankly, think it's only a matter of time before many more do, because the support is there. I mean, 3 out of 4 Americans, no matter how you cut it, support this notion that the money should follow the child. And so I don't know that there will be, that the unions and their allies will be able to maintain the grip that they've had. But I'm ever the optimist, so I will be very hopeful that more and more Democrats. Now, I understand the Democrat candidate for governor in Pennsylvania has actually vowed to support the bill that Republicans have advanced there to establish an education savings account in Pennsylvania. So.
In Arizona, progress being made in Arizona.
Well, yes, Arizona. Not that was with the support of lots of great folks over a lot of years in Arizona, but the first state to adopt a universal program, education savings account program there. So in Arizona now, and a big victory today or this week in that the education savings account program was signed into law about a couple months ago, and opponents of it quickly mounted a challenge and an attack, and they were trying to get a referendum on the ballot for this November. They failed to collect enough signatures, so that's a big, huge move and a good victory for kids in Arizona. But this is a really important bill also in that it's the first state that will adopt a statewide universal program of education freedom where every family, no matter where they live, no matter what their family's income, if your assigned school is not working for your child, you'll be able to take 90% of what the state spends on that child, roughly $7,000 in Arizona, and you'll be able to use it to buy educational services for your child. So you could customize it. Yes, it's a big thing. So you could customize it and do a variety of different approaches to put together your child's education, or you could take it all and have it go to one school. But in Arizona, there were a lot of families during the pandemic, especially in the urban areas, who out of necessity banded together and scraped together the resources to be able to do essentially a 21st century one-room schoolhouse approach for their kids. And it's working for many of them. They want to continue this. And so these opportunities, I think, will continue to grow and iterate and provide new and innovative approaches for kids to experience their learning. It's a really, really important move, and Arizona will be an encouragement for a state like Florida, which has long been the leader. They now have to look at Arizona and say, we've got some more work to do. And a state like Texas, which has been an anomaly, it should have a major choice program just by virtue of its political undergirding, and that is more possible today than ever before. And again, I think it's primarily because of families' experiences during the pandemic.
So let's switch gears and talk college. We have a university president in our audience. Why is college so expensive?
Would you like to comment on that? Well, the costs for higher education have continued to accelerate well beyond the level of inflation, and there's lots of different opinions around what's the primary driver, but I would argue that when the federal government federalized student lending in 2010, ostensibly to pay for Obamacare, the federal government decided, and this was, supported very narrowly by the other party, decided that they could do a better job and make money off those student loans in a way that the private markets couldn't do. And when that shift took place, the acceleration in costs for higher education just went through the roof. And when I came into office, the balance of student debt was about $1.4 trillion. It's now grown to 1.6 or 7 trillion. And of course, everybody's heard about the Biden plan to forgive a bunch of student debt, which is, that's a misnomer. You don't just forgive debt, you just shift it to somebody else. And in this case, it would be shifted to 2 out of 3 Americans who didn't go to college or didn't take student debt on. And it's a horrible policy, a horrible idea, horrible policy. It's illegal, and it is and will be challenged. The first lawsuit's been filed just this week, but and there'll be more. But there is no governor on the cost of higher education under the framework of student lending today. There is no, institutions don't really have skin in the game. All of the monies for the student loans are sent to the institutions, and the students really don't ultimately have control over that, nor do they, understand that and in many cases understand that this is actually a debt that needs to be paid back. And this notion that we're going to just wave away a whole bunch of them and forgive them, and then that's going to solve a problem? No, it doesn't solve it. In fact, I think it exacerbates a problem even more. It doesn't change the underlying dynamics in any way, and all it will do is incentivize students to not pay their loans and incentivize institutions to continue to raise prices or to add more amenities to their offering to try to attract more students. It's a really bad situation.
How do we break that? How do we break that cycle?
Well, first of all, I think the student lending needs to be, put back into the private markets, and there's a role for the federal government in a portion of it, but lending needs to have undergirding. There has to be logic to how that happens. It doesn't happen today. Federal student aid is currently part of the Department of Education. As I pointed out while there, it is ripe for politicization, weaponization, which we're exactly seeing today. It needs to be a separate entity and governed by a non-political body, much like the FDIC or something like that, where there is student lending that has to take place federally. But I would again argue a lot of it needs to go back into the private markets. And a third important area is accreditation has to continue to be reformed and opened up for more innovators and providers to enter the higher ed space. At the same, I think there's also an important point in time now, because I think a lot of students who were in college or are thinking about college are questioning the value of college because of students' experiences during the pandemic. Paying all their tuition while sitting in an apartment they're paying for and not being able to be with class. I mean, the whole experience for many of them was very bad. So that is raising very good questions about the value. And I think that the more opportunities there are to provide a higher education experience at a much lower cost and a much quicker path to a well-paying career, students are evaluating that more and more today. But accreditation and how that happens is a big gatekeeper in that regard. There's also, as we know, millions of jobs going unfilled that don't require a four-year degree, and we need to de-emphasize the importance of going to a four-year college or university and instead emphasize the multitude of pathways a young person should consider and be exposed to, frankly, as early as their middle school years, to a variety of options, a variety of paths they might choose, including, and importantly, expanding apprenticeship opportunities. And the private sector has an important role to play in, I think in many cases, stepping up and just starting to solve the problems by getting together with others in their region and addressing some of these things and being direct competition to some of the the four-year institutions that are really just there to take the resources in without ultimately providing much to the student. Let me just mention one of the things that we did that I think is an important tool, and I hope that others in the private sector will build on. We added to what's called the college scorecard more granular information about so if you're a prospective student and you want to compare programs at 2 or 3 different colleges or universities, you can go into the college scoreboard, find those institutions, see how much it's going to cost at each of those institutions to attend, and then look at the program of study you're interested in and find out what graduates from that program are earning the first, second, third, fourth, fifth year after they have graduated from that program. So you can compare between schools. You can look at within schools different programs of study because all of that data used to be reported out in aggregate. So you have engineers with English majors and every other program. So it was taking the mean or the average rather than what those specific programs of study are, and that's a really important tool that can serve prospective students well.
So my final question for you tonight, I think we can all see why the Secretary describes herself in the book as a disruptor. What does that mean to you, and what's next for Betsy DeVos?
Well, some people look at the word disruption as a negative. I grew up in a family where my parents always urged and encouraged us to try new things, to do things differently, not just settle for the way things have always been done. And my dad was a really great entrepreneur who always saw a better way to do things. I think I got that gene, and there are very few things I can look at where I think, I think we can tweak that a little bit and do it a little bit. So I look at disruption not as necessarily a 180 shift from something to something else, but as an intentional effort to get better at whatever it is you're doing. And when it comes to K-12 education in particular, it's something that I think the way we're doing it needs to be interrupted. And I think interruption and disruption are very closely related and alike. It needs to have an interruption to ultimately serve the ones that, the individuals it's supposed to be serving better. And I don't think anyone, if they're really honest with themselves, can argue that we can't do better for kids in their K-12 experience. And doing better means doing differently than what we've been doing for decade after decade after decade. And that is not to discount the many who have done really great and important things to do things differently within the K-12 world, but it's to say we need to change the emphasis from systems getting funded and getting supported to students getting funded and supported. And when that shift occurs, the power of the consumer will demand and then ultimately create a whole lot more options and menu choices that will be the right thing for every kid that is able to avail themselves of it.
Well, you're a hero to many people in this room tonight and many more watching online and many children. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Secretary DeVos. And you can pick up additional copies of Hostages No More in our gift shop. Thank you and good night.